Thank you for joining us in Developing Resilient Families. Today we're joined by Guylaine Hubbard-Brosmer. She is a wonderful woman who helps people with adoptions. And so today we're going to be discussing adoption. Thank you for Guylaine joining us. Can you give us a little bit of information on how you go about family adoptions?
Well, there's several approaches to adoption, and we usually distinguish between a county placement or public adoption, which is foster to adopt children that were taken into the child welfare system and are unable to reunite with their biological families. So other interested parents are out there that are looking to grow, either start a family or grow their family if they already have other children in the family. And then there is also private adoption that can be done with the help of an adoption agency and or an adoption attorney. And in that situation, couples are looking to find what we often refer to as birth parents or expectant parents, somebody who has an unintended pregnancy and they don't want the option of terminating the pregnancy, so they choose to make an adoption plan and match with a family and then place that baby for adoption with the family. There's also a third type that I probably won't reference too much today, and that is international adoption, which is something that's been on a steep decline over the past 5 to 10 years, especially for a variety of reasons, but that kind of follows a little bit more of a county placement, because with international adoption, those are all children, usually orphans, but not always orphans, that are being raised in some sort of community care, institutionalized care. And there aren't local families who are willing or able to adopt them. So there's international adoption agencies that have, very stringent regulations, but they look for parents in other countries to adopt those children.
Wow. So when you're looking for families, and it sounds to me it's mostly like when you're doing your services, it's mostly families who are related to these children and potentially have already been in that home. Is that the case? Or
no, actually that's sort of a misconception, because when you talk about a county or foster to adopt situation in particular, most public adoption agencies like Department of Children and Family Services, they go by various names, but most agencies will initially, if a child needs to be removed from a home, they will attempt to find related family members who can adopt those children, but a lot of times there's no family available. So those kids can actually go to a family that just contacts the county social services. It's usually run through or governed by Department of Social Services, and families can sign up with them and say, I would like to adopt. And usually you're talking about an older child, because infants, it's much less common, just because of the time period that even if an infant goes into the system, as we tend to refer to it, as an infant, it takes time before the biological parents' rights can be terminated, and before the biological parents can go through what the court requires of them in order to be reunified with their child. And if they can't be reunified, then the child becomes available for adoption. So there's actually a lot of families out there that will adopt children, you know, who don't have a family member that they can be raised with.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And how long would you say that a typical adoption takes for a family to go through the whole process?
It varies widely, but most adoption professionals coming in tell you to anticipate waiting a minimum of a year, and it's more common for it to take a couple of years. And usually when somebody is making that transition, especially if they've had an infertility experience and have turned to adoption because their infertility treatments haven't worked, or they can't afford, or whatever the reason is for them making that transition. 2 years even sounds like a really long time, but if you think about a pregnancy taking 9 months to start with, the preparation type from the time that someone decides, okay, I'm going to do a private option and I'm using an adoption attorney, by the time they get through the home study assessment and the home study process and are really out there and available to welcome a child into their family, you know, that's at least 6 months. And there's also a surprising number of potential adoptive families out there that are waiting at any given time. So it's a matter of waiting for the right situation or the right child to come along, and, you know, the stars to align and all of that for it to happen.
Yeah, I totally understand that. My husband and I were going through that during the time that we were trying to get pregnant, and it took me 3 years to get pregnant, and I was going through the whole adoption, foster adopt process. And then I ended up pregnant with triplets, and it was just, I just couldn't find myself going through the process with triplets. So I pulled out, unfortunately, and I still would love to do adoption at one point. So, and that's pretty common too, I hear, is that once, you know, some of these people, they go through fertility treatment, then they go through the adoption process, then somehow the stars align for their body to just release the energy to become pregnant, which is really astounding in itself.
Yeah, and that's something you hear a lot when you're going through it. But I remember years ago, so I have 2 adult children. My husband and I adopted them. They're 26 and 27. And when we were going through it, and we were attending support groups and meeting other people going through the same process at the same time, and people would say, you know, everything from just relax and you'll get pregnant to, you know, well, if you adopt, then, you know, lo and behold, you know, sometimes that's all it takes is to start the process. And I was always told that in either of those situations, it's really only about maybe 5%, but certainly less than 10% of the time that tends to happen.
Wow.
I did have one client one time who signed up to do an adoption, and then she She did get pregnant and had a successful pregnancy. So they put the whole adoption process on hold, much like yourself. And a couple years later, they came back again and said, okay, we want a second child. So let's start the adoption process over again. And as soon as they signed up, lo and behold, she got pregnant again. So they ended up having their family of 2 children, which they
Aw.
thought was going to happen by adoption, and they ended up having both their kids, and so and that was a rarity because I've worked with hundreds
Yeah.
of couples and singles, and you know, it does happen sometime, but you can pretty much say anything happens at least one time.
Right.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
that sort of thing.
So how do you begin the process with the interest of the families? So like, you know, I know that it was a long time when I started to go through the process. I know there's a home study, and you have to go to some classes to, you know, to ensure that you understand what's going on in this child's life, and, you know, things that you may experience. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what it is that you say to these parents that are potential adoption parents that are going to start this?
Well, first off, I encourage people to make sure they educate themselves and understand what all their options are so they can make a, you know, educated decision about which direction they want to go. Like when I first started, you know, I mentioned international, domestic, private, and public adoptions. And they're all very different, and they all require a home study. And the home studies for all 3 routes are a little bit different.
Oh, really? I thought they would all be the same.
They cover the same things, but I'm based in California, and I know that this isn't just true of California, but there's sort of this nationwide format that's out there that I know in the state of California, all public adoption agencies use that format. So you're still doing a domestic adoption because your adoption's happening within the US, but like a major consideration when you're adopting from a public child welfare system is the child is coming into your family with history. They
Right.
have a biological family that they were raised with, you know, whatever the reasons are, whether it's neglect, abuse, you know, criminal activity, drug use, and those types of things, which are the most common reasons for a child to be removed from a home.
Right.
But you know, there's still that what we refer to as the family of origin issues in terms of that type of adoption. And so the children have at some level been exposed to some sort of trauma, even if they weren't physically abused, just the family dynamic and the setting lends itself to that exposure to trauma. And therefore, parenting a child that comes from that background is much different than when you're parenting a child from birth. So with private adoption, you are parenting from birth,
Right.
usually at the hospital when the child is born, and many times you can even be in the adoptive parents can be in the delivery room when the child is born.
Nice.
So the piece that's different from having a biological child is you didn't experience the entire 9 months of the pregnancy, but you know, from the point of birth on, and there's even been articles that have been written referring to post-adoption depression instead of postpartum depression.
Oh, interesting. Wow, I didn't
Because
even
the
know that was a
process
thing.
for preparing for adoption can be very intense in its own way and very emotional, and
Yeah.
going through the home study process, you know, having a stranger come into your home and asking you all these very personal questions,
Right.
and things like that, which is all part of the home study process to prepare you. Yet somebody who's having a biological child doesn't have to go through that experience to prepare ahead of time. It kind of comes naturally, you know, the classes that you mentioned in terms of taking classes as part of the home study. So there are different aspects depending on the route that you're adopting through. So even though there's similarities, there's also some significant differences. But every state in the US has its own adoption regulations. Adoption is one of those areas that, even though there are some federal regulations, each state has its own set of adoption and foster care regulations. So even though you can't, a person can adopt, you know, across state lines by matching with a birth mom or even a child who's living in a different state, you have to follow both states' regulations, you know, the state where the adoptive parents live and the state where the child is either currently living or the state where the child is born.
Wow. So now you have two states in your home doing the home study then?
Well, no, the home study has to be done by an agency that's licensed in the state where the adoptive family lives.
Oh, okay.
And because that's where the child is going to be raised. So the state sets those guidelines of what needs to be included in a home study. And the agency that's providing the social worker to do the home study may have their additional requirements. Like, again, going back to the classes for preparation, there's different classes that are required that are actually a state requirement when you are adopting a child out of foster care.
Wow.
When you're doing a private adoption, a lot of the classes that are required are actually set by the agency. And it might cover some of the same things, but it could be, you know, parenting classes, you know, and particularly with the public adoption, foster care to adopt, they want to make sure that the adoptive parents have the tools to parent a child who comes from this exposure to trauma.
Right.
All adoptive parents also need to be prepared for the grief and loss that comes with adoption, even though, you know, there's the happy ending from the perspective of the adoptive parents.
Right.
You know, there is loss, especially if it's an older child, there's the loss of the birth family. But even when there's an infant adoption, the birth parents, birth family members, whoever is involved in the process, they are going to experience their own sense of loss by the baby being placed for adoption. But the big difference between the two processes is that with private adoption, the birth mom or birth parents are voluntarily placing the baby for adoption because they are taking an active role in finding the family that their child's going to be raised with. Whereas with a county placement, it is, you know, the county agency or somebody who's contracted with the county agency that is doing matching with a particular child and family.
Yeah. So, so the potential for the family that's seeking another family for their child to be adopted, that could potentially be an open adoption, correct?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And even with county placements, you know, everybody's sort of natural knowledge of adoption tends to be with the child welfare system,
Yeah.
unless you had some other, you know, exposure to it for some reason. So the view of the child welfare system is that, you know, a social worker comes in, removes the child from the home, the birth parents' rights are terminated, and that child goes and lives with another family, and everybody lives happily ever after, you know. But
Yeah.
there's a huge dynamic to that. So the evolution, if you will, even with county placements, is to have some level of openness, even in a county placement, and open adoption in private adoptions, you know, has continued to evolve, but it's been around. Open adoptions have been around for nearly, well, probably for over 30 years. My kids are in their you know, mid 20s, and we have an open adoption.
Oh,
Um,
wow. Yeah.
with our kids. In fact, my two kids actually have the same birth mother. They're born a year apart, but have the same birth mother, and we still have contact with her and her family.
Yeah, because I hear that, I mean, even if the children are adopted, there is still loss happening, even if they were adopted at infancy. I understand that when they get older, they still feel a sense of loss. They're grateful, you know, for having a family and being adopted, but I was just watching this documentary, and a lot of them still go through that loss, you know, like, you know, why did it happen? You know, they question it. And so I just think that open adoption is a blessing, somewhat, because it does take a village to raise a child. And
Yeah.
you know, even though that they were the birth parents weren't able to care for that child at that time, and they're able to give their child a better life, and that's the ultimate goal, right? I mean, even if you have a child of your own, if you don't, if you're raising your niece or your nephew, the goal is to make sure that that child has a better life than the one that you had. And
Right.
and that means anything. Like, it can mean, you know, being raised by two different families and enjoying that openness and that bonding, but understanding that you still have some form of structure from one family.
Yeah. And you know, there's plenty of women who place babies for adoption, not you know, the reasons. There's a wide variety of reasons, and she could be a college student, or
Right.
you know, furthering her education, or just getting started in her career, or not wanting to be a single parent even if she's fully capable of being a single parent.
Yeah.
There's a variety of reasons, and of course, nobody knows what the future holds. But if it doesn't fit into, if a baby doesn't fit into her life at that particular time in her life, then that would be a reason to place. And with the grief and loss that I mentioned, and you referred to the connection to birth family, being in an open adoption and having some level of contact, it may not 100%, you know, resolve those questions,
Mm.
but you have a source to direct those questions to.
Yeah.
Um, and research on open adoption has shown that it's better for all parties involved. Now, you know, I'm a social worker, and social workers are prevalent in the field of adoption. And one of the first things we learn is what's in the best interest of the child, like you were just mentioning.
Right.
So the child is the focal point, but when you're going through the adoption process, you have the adoptive parents on one hand, and you have the birth parents or biological parents on the other hand. And it's bringing them all together to work towards what is in the best interest of the child, even though, you know, in some ways the position that both sides are in, they're totally opposite.
Right.
But that's what comes together. You have the adoptive parents that want to start a family, and you have the birth parents that you know, in a county adoption, you know, I've seen birth parents that have had multiple children removed from the home, or the youngest children removed from the home, and that whole dynamic. Or in a private adoption, you have somebody that's just not ready to start a family, and it could, you know, there's women out there who place a baby for adoption because, you know, they're overwhelmed. Maybe she is a single mom and already has 3 kids. She's pregnant with a 4th and is just not in a position to raise that 4th child.
Right.
And another important aspect of open adoption, besides, or in addition to being good for sort of for self-identity and that feeling of self-worth, and having the child grow up believing that they were not second best, or they were not cast aside, you know, that this was a loving choice, and it was done so they could have a better life than they would have had being raised in with their birth family. Is talking to the child about their adoption, and so that the child grows up with that good sense of identity, and by having an open adoption and talking to the child about adoption, the child has a sense of where they came from, even if there's not a strong connection to birth family or and biological family members. They at least have that background.
Yeah.
You know,
So
one story I've often told clients is, I had a good friend in high school. She was somebody I carpooled with, and we were about 16 when she found out that she had been adopted. And she found out because she was looking for something in her parents' bedroom and opened a drawer and was kind of rifling through the drawer, and she found adoption papers, and her parents had never told her. And that it was long before, it was kind of my first exposure to adoption, or one of my early exposures to it. And she was so hurt and so angry that her parents kept that information from her.
Wow.
You know, and that's one of my own earliest memories about adoption.
Yeah. So would you say that it's better to have the conversation earlier rather than later? So, I mean, at
Absolutely.
what age would you start talking to the child that, you know, that they were adopted, and what does that sound like?
It's I could do a whole separate seminar on this, but in fact I have. But I always tell people, you actually start having the conversation from the time you bring that baby home. And people, even though they hear it and try to follow it, it's still, especially when you're still waiting to adopt, when you're first preparing to adopt and you hear that, you know, it's very easy to think it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to be open and honest with my child. So when they start asking questions, I'm going to answer all those questions honestly. But the truth is, if you wait until a child is old enough to have questions and ask questions and formulate those questions in their mind, it's not too late, but it's much later and much more difficult. When you grow up having conversation about adoption, using language about adoption, identifying people in the child's family, including birth family members, and all of that, then it at least reduces the question the child is going to have. And it also brings up opportunity. And it's another aspect where open adoption comes into play. Because if you have an adoption that is open, whether it's doing what we're doing right now, video chatting, social media, or visits, that child is going to grow up knowing who their birth parents or birth mother, whoever the contact is with. The child will grow up knowing who those people are, just like the child grows up learning who grandparents are and aunts and uncles and cousins and friends and all of that.
So it's kind of providing a sense of security for them, really.
Yeah. And I've seen adoptive parents in the past who would say, okay, we're going to have this open adoption. We have the birth parents, but then they started referring to the birth parents as an aunt and an uncle. And it's like, they're not an aunt and uncle. They're birth parents. They might not be mommy and daddy who the child is growing up with, but you know, that brings on more confusion instead of allaying the fears and the security. So,
you typically,
adults now with my own kids, it's like they don't really know any differently. They always knew they were adopted. So I don't think if you ask either one of them, when did you find out you were adopted, it's something they've always known.
Yeah.
You know.
So when the child is, you know, learning that they have a birth parent, so do you describe them as the birth parent when you're communicating this to the children? Like, okay, this is your birth parent, and I'm your mommy. Is that kind of what you would say that the conversation sounds like, or is it?
It is to some extent. Like I mentioned, when we teach our children who their other families are, when we point to somebody in a picture, we might say, you know, this is your grandmother and use her name. But, you know, like with grandparents and a lot of other relatives, like cousins in particular, you never go up to somebody and say, hi, cousin Joey. You know, that's extremely rare just in terms of our vernacular and how we phrase things. You just grow up knowing that Joey is your uncle. So there is a similarity there with birth parents. So you're not going to address a birth mother as, hi, birth mother Susie.
Right.
You just address her as Susie. And there are families out there that do come up with sort of a different name for their birth mother, their child's birth mother. Yeah. But that's kind of more personalized. It's much more common when you're visiting or addressing that birth parent to use first names, to call them by their
Okay.
first name.
Yeah, so because I just wouldn't know what that would, sound like until you mentioned how, you're right. When we talk to our uncles, our aunts, we just say, "Hey, auntie." Um, in my case, I say, Thea, and so I was just curious, like how do they communicate with that person? Because I always wonder too, does the birth mother, or become offended by being called by their first name? Does that ever happen? Does it, is there any kind of, confusion as to, why they call that person that name? Does that ever come up, or is it?
Um, it, I won't say it never comes up, but if everyone is properly prepared when going through the process, and that's where the educational component comes in, and that's also another strength and component of open adoption
Yeah.
is you're having conversations, hopefully, or oftentimes in advance of the birth. You're having conversations about how does the birth mom want to be addressed, and with counseling, telling the birth mother in particular, or birth parents, that even though you're providing the genetic material, you're giving birth, to this baby, you will always be their birth mother, but
Mhm.
they're going to be raised by, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. So Mrs. Smith is mommy and Mr. Smith is going to be daddy.
Yeah.
So the onus is on the adoptive parents to provide that information with their child and prepare the child. So again, it doesn't seem weird. If you grow up having somebody by the name of Susie and the
Yeah.
child understands that that's their birth mother, they'll always know that regardless of the name or the term used to refer to her.
Yeah. So when the birth parent has fully decided to, let the child be adopted, are they um are they counseled on how to, interact with that family? I mean, because there has to be some kind of emotional stability to be able to do that, right? I mean,
Right,
not
right.
everybody is capable of being okay with letting their child go. I would imagine. I mean, it's not an easy thing to go through.
Right. And therein lies the advantage of having some level of openness in the adoptions, because you do have that. It's an ongoing relationship, it's ongoing conversation, and everybody's prepared in terms of what to expect. But having a good, solid, open adoption, it helps to have adoption professionals in place that are promoting that, so that parents moving forward, and even birth parents moving forward, have access to that information, somebody to turn to in the future, if things go awry, or if they lose contact, or if adoptive parents, didn't really start that conversation from the very beginning, and now
Yeah.
their child is 3 and they're talking about adopting another child, and they realize, oh, we need to have this conversation so our child understands what's going on. So it's really important, if there's not somebody still available at the agency that the family use, there are other adoption professionals like myself, who are out there who can help with that.
Yeah.
So it is healthier.
Yeah. So how long would you say they stay in counseling? I mean, because you're an adoptive, you have an adopted, two adopted children. I mean, how long? I mean, I would say that it was like an ongoing process until the child was fully, I mean, your brain isn't fully developed till you're 24 or 25. So, I
Right.
mean, at what point would you say that they are actually fully okay with what has happened over their time, as
Um,
a child?
well, everybody is different for
Yeah.
starters, but even though the resource is an adoption counselor, it doesn't necessarily mean that like birth parents are in counseling. It's having the resource to turn to. Like I, at one point worked for an agency that we had both adoptive parents and birth parents that would contact us way after the adoption was finalized. And it was more for generalized support, advice, or help, either with their relationship or with things that were going on with the child who had been adopted, um, and all of that. If a birth mom is working with an agency, then she would have certainly during that post placement period, because it takes several months before the adoption is actually finalized. So during that period, then birth parents would have more direct access to counseling, or they may be in a position like we did actually with our kids' birth mom, is we paid for her to have, it was 6 or 8 sessions of counseling with a therapist or a counselor who specialize not only in adoption but open adoption, um, just to help her kind of get back on her feet and go through that postpartum adjustment.
Yeah.
So there could be that intensive counseling at the beginning, but it's not like either the adoptive child or the birth parents are in long-term ongoing counseling, unless they're in therapy for sort of other just other mental health
Yeah.
reasons, or that sort of thing. But the ongoing counseling per se, is not really needed in that sense.
Hmm. Well, that's good to know. I mean, because I was always curious about how people manage that, because I mean, it is it's a big deal, to be able to communicate with your child. I hear a lot of people saying, "Oh no, I'm not going to tell my kid till they're an adult. I want them to feel like, this is their family." Well, you know, sometimes some things just happen, just like that. Your friend, when you were 16, she found out.
Yeah,
It's traumatizing in itself,
yeah,
for that person.
yeah. Not providing information is can be equated with lying. Not that
Yeah,
there's all these parents out there that go around lying to their kids,
right.
but withholding information, can be very damaging, because that's when questions will arise in terms of, well, why didn't you tell me? Is there something wrong with me? Was there something wrong with my birth parents?
Hmm.
Is this a shameful process? And when you have that situation, it's those feelings that children can internalize, and that's when the shame and the resentment and those other aspects can come up for the child. It's because of information that they were given from the very beginning.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's the other thing, because it's a conversation that at some point all parents have to have, and it makes virtually every parent uncomfortable, is, you know, the birds and the bees talk. So if for every, you know, 4 or 5 or 6-year-old that asks, where do babies come from? And the parents give this whole story about, you know, a stork dropping them, you know, off at the hospital and
Yeah.
things like that, then the child finds out in a few years, you know, it's like, wait a minute, you know, why does the baby have to be dropped off at the hospital? You know, sick people go to the hospital. You know, it conjures up so much more that you have to work around. So,
Yeah.
so providing honest, age-appropriate information to the child is what's important, and that even goes beyond adoption.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think it's important just to, if a child asks a question, you should respond honestly and at their level. And, you know, it's common courtesy, right? I mean, they are
Yeah,
human
it's
beings
respect.
as well. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
respect. And if you're going to lie to the child, then eventually later on they're just not going to believe you, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, it's that old saying of children learn what they live.
Yeah.
And if you're withhold information, if you're not being completely honest, I'll move away from the term lying, but if you're not being completely honest and withholding things or giving misinformation, then that child is going to grow up thinking, oh, well, that's what my parents did, so that's okay,
It's
you know, for
normal.
me to do
Mhm.
too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to say thank you again, Guylaine. I just want for joining us. Can you tell us like your website and you know, what it is exactly that you would like to provide parents who are looking to adopt, and if there's
Um,
anything else out there?
I I am currently a adoption consultant, and I work for myself. I have years of experience. First, I worked in the infertility field, and then in the adoption field. So I was working in the infertility field when my husband and I went through our infertility experience and then ended up adopting. And when I left that field of work, I knew I wanted to work in adoption because I already had that personal experience. So I called my company All About Adoption because that to me is my life and something I'm very passionate about it, both from the professional side as well as from the personal side. So what I do for clients of mine is, if you just have questions, a lot of the things we touched on today but didn't go into detail about making decisions and educating yourselves about the adoption process. So I can provide adoption education and support. You know, I've talked to people who were actually in a match already and just needed to learn more about how to navigate that open adoption relationship. I've met with many adoptive parents who didn't start that conversation early. And I've met with people that had toddlers, and even met with one adoptive mom who had a preteen and everything in between, because they either needed to supplement or expand the conversation with their child about adoption and their birth family. And I even had one family who went into adoption hoping to have that open adoption relationship and ended up with a placement where the birth mother didn't want any contact. So they still wanted to know very early on how to have that conversation with their child growing up to give them those feelings and that sense of self-identity and connectedness to a birth family that they weren't going to have the chance to actually know their birth family. And I've done quite a bit of work because I've have a lot of experience doing home studies and being a home study supervisor. So that's another aspect I can kind of talk people through. And if somebody comes to me and I can't provide what they really need, then I have a lot of connections in the field, and I'm happy to help them find appropriate resources and places to go where they can get exactly what they're looking for.
Well, that's so amazing, Guylaine. I think you're an amazing human being. It takes a lot
Thank you.
of patience, understanding, and a strong will to be able to help people be guided through this process. It is not an easy process. So I want to say thank you again, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Join us next time in Developing Resilient Families.